All right, it's gotten cold outside, but there's still a lot of really big fish to be caught on a glide bait this time of year. This is the time of year where like you're not probably going to get as many bites on a big bait, but the ones that you catch are going to be some of the biggest ones in the lake. So let's kind of shift our approach and really dissect what's important and how we've got to change our approach in the wintertime and when the water temperatures get cold to target those bigger than average fish and catch them on a glide bait. So there's three main points that I want to make. There's first is location. We've got to switch up our location about where we're targeting these fish a little bit. The second is retrieve. There's a couple very unique retrieves that I use in the wintertime to help trigger these bigger than average fish. And three is casting angles. Casting angles are important at all times of year, but I just want to reiterate it now and kind of tell you how I'm going to approach different pieces of structure and cover this time of year by switching up my angles. But a couple notes before we get started. This isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. This is my experience. You ask a million people, you're gonna get a million different answers about what they do. There's gonna be some people like, I don't even throw a glide bait in the wintertime. But from my experience, it's still worth it. You can still get a lot of big fish on it. The second point I wanna make is they kind of tend to get temperamental with the size of bait that they want to eat this time of year. It's not always they're eating big stuff. It's not always they're eating little stuff. So you've got to mix up with your sizes of baits. So sometimes you'll catch them on something like a Boss, which is a 9 3/4 inch bait. Sometimes you'll catch them on a little guy like the Eco, which is 6 1/4. And sometimes you'll catch them on a little 3.3 swim bait, just a tiny little paddle tail just back there, just through the water. So mix up the sizes of baits. The size of bait that they're keyed in on changes from time to time. I like to think that the big ones will always eat a big bait, but that's just not necessarily the case. And like, you got to think about it. If you're sitting there, you're eating cheeseburgers nonstop for weeks on end, and you're like, man, I'm feeling bloated and stuff, I think I'll have a salad. And that's basically like the bass eating a little shad. I don't know if that's true, but it's a funny analogy. But anyway, so those are the 2 points I kind of want to make preemptively. Is just like, look, man, this is my experiences. And second, experiment with bait size. All right, the where. So what are we looking for when trying to target these bigger than average fish? The first place that sticks out in my mind where it's just like, yep, absolutely fishing there, and it's a great wintertime pattern. I've caught a ton of big fish doing it, is running main lake channel swing points. So you got a channel swing butts up against this big long tapering point that sticks out in the lake. Money spot. There's guaranteed to be big fish there. One thing that I really like to kind of keep in mind in this wintertime is those fish like to have deeper water access nearby. Whether it could be just a small little drop, it could be a big old channel swing drop. That's gonna depend more about the area of the country. I know in like Texas, they like to get in those little drains where that can be 4 foot up on the edges and 6 to 8 foot in the middle, and it runs back. Just some sort of little bit deeper water nearby, and that's kind of what they're going to be around. Second, this time of year, they really like to suspend. They're cold-blooded animals. It's basically a big water lizard. So what they're going to do is they're going to try to sun themselves and warm themselves up. So they'll sit up higher in the water column, radiating that sun's heat. If you got standing timber in the water, that standing timber can be a little bit warmer because that also radiates heat, and it's going to draw them to that a little bit more. But don't necessarily think that, oh, it's cold, those big fish are just sitting on the bottom. They do get on the bottom, but a lot of times this time of year, they will sit up higher, radiate that sun, especially on a sunny day, and those are prime fish to target with the glide bait. Just basically throwing it over their head and working it back nice and slow. We'll get into retrieves a little bit more later. Second one, a hump. Any piece of structure that you look at on a map and you're like, okay, that's probably got a really high percentage chance of holding a bass, that's what we're going to target this time of year. So points, humps, little saddles, anything that those fish can kind of pull up on, relate to, and suspend. We already talked about them liking subtle little depth changes. Look for that kind of stuff on a map where those topographic lines get a little bit closer together. Great spot to target these fish. We've talked about structure. Now let's talk about cover. Standing timber is a big one. Something for them to get more vertical on. Brush piles. Another great example, especially if those brush piles kind of top out within 4 or 5 foot of the surface. You'll see them on live scope. They'll just kind of be up there, just kind of chilling on the top of it. Again, radiating that heat. So brush piles, rock piles are another good one. A lot of big fish get caught on rock piles this year. So look for great structure on great cover on different kinds of structure. Have a little bit of a depth transition nearby, and it's a recipe to find yourself a big one. Another really critical piece of cover that these fish will get on in the wintertime, especially if you're in the Ozarks or a lake with docks, is look for black floats. So those black floats are also radiating that heat from the sun, and it warms up that water just immediately around it, and those fish will gravitate towards that. Now, if you're on a place like Lake of the Ozarks, there's a million docks with black floats. How do we kind of switch that up? Well, look at the structure that it's on. Is that dock on a point? Is it on a secondary point? Like, is there a rock transition in the back? Look for a little something different on the actual structure of the lake. And then if there happens to be a black float on that piece of structure, perfect. Target that. But don't just go down the lake saying, Josh told me to fish a bunch of black floats and I fished every black float on the lake. It's like, no, you need to dial it in a little bit more than just black floats. But it is a piece of cover that can hold a fish. And another note on wear. It seems like a full moon will typically pull those big fish a little bit shallower. Even if they're not fixing the spawn, it just seems like those bigger fish will kind of move just a little bit shallower on a full moon. So it can kind of switch up, and you can kind of start accessing a little bit shallower and shallower water when you've got a big full moon in the sky. Just something to keep in mind. It's not a 100% deal, but if you are fishing and it happens to be a full moon, try fishing just a little bit shallower than what you normally would, and you might be turning some heads. All right, let's start talking about retrieves. This is the time of year where I tend to kind of get away from that real quick choppy action on a bait. I'm slowing it down a lot more. I like to work a lot of reel bumps at the time of year. And basically all that means is boom, reel, reel, reel. And basically that bait's kicking out, suspending, kicking out, suspending, kicking out, and suspending. Basically think of it as a giant jerkbait. Jerkbaits are a very powerful tool this time of year for good reason. They catch a ton of fish. So basically we're making our glide baits act like a giant version of a jerkbait. And don't be a robot with it. Don't make your bait just look like it's doing one thing in the water all the way back. Switch it up just a little bit, just like you would with a jerkbait. You'd be pop, 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 pop. You're switching up your cadence. Do the same thing with a glide bait. Go reel, 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 reel. And it's just kicking back and forth. Kick, 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 back and forth real quick. And just something a little bit that if you do have one following it, if it does have its eye on it, something to kind of make it finish and attack the actual bait. So switch up your retrieves. And the second retrieve that does really well for me this time of year is just a slow and steady wind. It's not kicking super, super wide. You're not getting as wide as you possibly can with a bait, but it's just having a nice slalom back and forth in the water, just slowly moving. And if you're me, like I said, I like to mix stuff up a lot. So I'll do a slow retrieve, then give it a couple bum, bum, kick it wide. And start slow retrieving again. Every once in a while, boom, boom, kick it wide and make it a little bit snappy. You're not going super snappy, but you're getting it a little bit of something extra. Just giving that fish something to like make him commit. So those are the two retrieves I really utilize and lean on heavy this time of year. Like I said, I kind of get away from the super choppy stuff. It's really fun to fish that way, but they don't react to it, and they don't fire on it as much as they do in like the spring, the fall, and the summer. All right, casting angles are huge when it comes to throwing these big baits, especially in the wintertime. And the main tip I can give you here is watch how everyone else works down the lake. Like if they're fishing a main primary point, watch how every single person fishes it. Typically it's all the same way. Usually they're gonna sit out over deeper water, fire up to the shallow, and work their jerkbait back, work their jig back, work something back from shallow to deep. And it's the biggest tip I can give you on this is pay attention and then do the opposite of what they do. Think about fishing like a little local community pond. We've all fished those. If you're just going down the bank, just throwing out to the middle, bringing it back, throwing it out to the middle, bringing it back, you're not getting a ton of bites. But if you can make that big long cast to the other bank and then start working it off the other bank, it's amazing how many more bites you get. And it's because those fish are seeing it from a slightly different angle. That's the kind of principle that we're applying here to a normal lake. So instead of sitting out in deeper water, casting shallow, get your boat to the backside of a point and cast out over deeper water and start working it to shallow. It's amazing how many more fish you'll catch doing that. Now, truth be told, it's really hard to do that, changing up the angles with every single cast. So Where I really apply that angles and really going out of your way to put your boat in a completely different position is on the really high percentage targets. And just going down the bank, you can't really, it's really hard to kind of change that angle up. So fishing points, fishing humps, fishing rock piles, brush piles, all that stuff, it's a lot easier to change up your angle and make a different presentation than the way that the fish are typically used to seeing it. All right, and one last tip when it comes to throwing these big baits in the wintertime. A lot of times, if I've found a school, I may not catch them on the big bait, but I can fire up the school with a big bait. So I'll wrap some lead wire around the front hook, make that rate of fall just a little bit faster, sink it down over that rock pile, sink it down over that point, sink it down over the top of those fish, and give it a couple good pops, and you'll get that school fired up. They'll kind of come up to it and they'll get all fired up on it, and then they'll go back to their rock pile. Well, now those things are all sorts of feisty down there. I'll throw a jerkbait out over them, I'll throw a jig over them, and I will catch a bunch of fish because I got them fired up on the glide. There's been several 20-pound bags I've caught off one spot that I was casting a jerkbait over it, a jig over it, not catching anything. I sink a glide down over it, I didn't catch any on the glide, but I got that big girl down there to be like, huh? And they move a little bit, and now they come unglued on everything else that I throw on them. So keep that in mind. Try that. If you're like, man, I can't get these fish to respond to anything in the wintertime, it'll probably catch you a few more fish. So like and subscribe for more videos to come. We're going to try to do a lot more of these breakdowns. Thanks, guys.